Happy holidays, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to tonight's chilling Christmas tales. I hope you're ready for a story that will leave you questioning what's lurking in the shadows this season. If you enjoyed the eerie atmosphere, don't forget to share your scariest holiday experiences in the comment section. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss another spine-tingling story. Stay safe, and remember, sometimes the scariest things aren't under the tree, but hiding just beyond the flicker of the Christmas lights. Christmas week. The time of year when the world seemed to glow with holiday cheer, where laughter echoed from every corner and bright lights twinkled from every shop window. But for me, it only magnified the emptiness that had been creeping into my life for months. I wandered through the crowded mall trying to get some last-minute shopping done, but the holiday spirit only deepened my depression. Everywhere I turned, there were people laughing, families bundled together, hands full of gifts and excitement. Children's faces lit up with glee as they gazed at the elaborate displays, and couples strolled hand in hand, caught up in the festive magic of the season. But I felt like an outsider, as if I were trapped in a scene from a movie I didn't belong in. The holiday season had always been a reminder of everything I didn't have. No family to gather with, no partner to share a quiet evening by the tree, no warmth in my life to match the fire that burned in the shop's windows. I hated how it made me feel, like I was drowning in the joy of others while I just went through the motions. I shuffled from store to store, picking up random items unable to muster any real enthusiasm for them. The tinsel and ornaments, the fake snow scattered on the windows, none of it sparked the feeling I was supposed to have. I was alone. That was the reality. By the time I made it home, I was exhausted, emotionally drained from the forced cheerfulness that surrounded me. I looked around my empty apartment, feeling the weight of my life settle in. My routine had become suffocating, and the thought of enduring another year of the same endless cycle seemed unbearable. That's when I saw the ad. It was a simple cabin deep in the woods. No distractions, no other people. Just the promise of isolation. For a brief moment, I thought it sounded like the perfect escape. A week away from everything, away from the pressure of the holidays, from the noise of the world, from the constant reminders of my own loneliness. I could disappear into the woods, let the silence consume me, and maybe, just maybe, come back with a clearer mind. The ad described the cabin as a rustic, charming retreat, nestled deep in the forest, miles away from civilization. It seemed too perfect to be true. An old, secluded cabin surrounded by snow-dusted pines and untouched wilderness. I hesitated for only a second before booking it. I arrived just a few days before Christmas. The world outside was a winter wonderland. Snowflakes swirling in the crisp air, dusting the trees and the ground in a pristine blanket of white. The cabin stood at the edge of the woods, its smoke curling from the chimney like a forgotten story, the windows glowing with a faint, welcoming warmth. The outside was exactly what I had imagined, isolated, peaceful. Inside, the cabin was quaint, decorated with old-fashioned furniture and wooden beams that gave it a homey feel. I immediately felt at ease, or so I tried to convince myself. There was a small fire burning in the stone hearth, and the scent of pine and wood smoke filled the air. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something. Hope, maybe. For a moment, it seemed like this was exactly what I needed. But as the days passed, the coldness that had followed me from the city seemed to seep deeper into my bones. The isolation wasn't as comforting as I'd imagined. The silence, which had once seemed like a reprieve, now felt oppressive, suffocating. It wasn't just the lack of human voices that made me uneasy. It was the feeling that the woods themselves were watching, waiting. The trees seemed to loom larger, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers. I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't truly alone in this cabin, that something, or someone, was with me. The first strange occurrence happened on the second evening. I had set my keys down on the kitchen counter next to a steaming mug of hot cocoa. It was a quiet night, the fire crackling softly in the corner, the wind howling outside. But when I returned to the kitchen after a few minutes, my keys were gone. I searched the counter, the table, the floor. Nothing. It took me an hour of frantic searching before I found them, sitting on the windowsill behind a small potted fern. The moment I saw them, a shiver ran down my spine. I was certain I had left them on the counter. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I had forgotten, but the unease clung to me, like the chill in the air. The following day, I decided to take a walk in the woods to clear my head. The snow crunched underfoot as I made my way along the narrow trail, the trees stretching above me like silent giants. There was no one else around, just the hush of the forest. The air felt thin, cold, and the deeper I walked, the more I felt as if the trees were closing in on me. The sunlight filtered through the branches in pale, fractured beams, casting long, eerie shadows on the snow-covered ground. I tried to shake the feeling of being watched, but it was impossible. Every step felt like an invitation to something unseen, something waiting. That night, after returning to the cabin, I found the door wide open. I was sure I had locked it. But there it was, the faintest draft curling into the cabin from the outside. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, but the house was empty. No one was there. I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling, and made my way upstairs to bed. But sleep would not come. The house felt alive, the walls creaking with whispers, the wind outside making the timbers groan and shudder. It felt as if something was moving just beyond my line of sight, always lurking just outside the corner of my vision. That night, I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate steps moving across the porch. They were slow, careful, as if whoever, or whatever, was outside was waiting for something. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow. The footsteps stopped just outside my door, and for what felt like an eternity, I lay there, frozen, staring at the shadows on the wall. I finally mustered the courage to open the door, but when I did, there was nothing, no one. The porch was empty, and the night was still. I closed the door behind me, locking it, but the feeling didn't leave. I wasn't alone. The next few days were a blur of uneasy restlessness. I told myself it was the isolation getting to me, the silence playing tricks on my mind. But when I started to hear things in the walls, I couldn't deny it any longer. The house wasn't just quiet, it was listening, watching. On Christmas Eve, I invited a friend, Claire, to visit, hoping to shake the feeling of being haunted by an invisible presence. She arrived, and after a quick look around, she seemed uneasy. "There's something about this place," she said, her voice a whisper. "It's like it doesn't want us here." The wind picked up, rattling the windows as if in agreement. Claire stood up abruptly, her eyes wide, her face pale. "I think I need to leave. I don't feel right." She left, driving off into the snowstorm without looking back. I spent Christmas Day alone in the cabin, too terrified to leave. That night, I woke up with a start. There was pressure on my chest, like icy fingers digging into my ribs. I couldn't breathe. My lungs refused to work. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the pressure released. I gasped for air, my heart hammering. I sat up in bed, my skin covered in cold sweat. The next morning, I noticed something in the bathroom mirror. The fog from my shower had accumulated as usual, but this time there was something written in the condensation. "Get out." I backed away slowly, but the words remained, carved into the mist. I ran from the bathroom, my mind racing. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The day I left the cabin, I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The drive back to the city was long, But the further I got from the woods, the more the weight in my chest lifted. I convinced myself it was just the isolation, the emptiness of the holiday season playing tricks on my mind. I was free. I could go back to my normal life. But that night, after a long day, I stepped into the shower, hoping to wash away the remnants of the experience. The hot water poured over me, and for a moment, I thought I could finally relax. But as the steam thickened, I saw it. The letters began to form on the bathroom mirror, just as they had in the cabin. Nowhere to run. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. My breath caught in my throat. I wiped the fog away frantically, but the message wouldn't disappear. It stayed there, burned into the glass, a chilling reminder that no matter how far I went, whatever haunted the woods, whatever followed me, was still there. Every Christmas Eve, the town of Frosthaven fell silent, not out of tranquility, but from a collective dread that gripped its residents. Beneath the glittering garlands and warm glow of string lights, an unspoken fear lingered, like frost creeping into the bones. Parents barred their children from venturing out after dusk, their eyes darting nervously toward the snow-covered woods that surrounded the town. But it was never enough. For as long as anyone could remember, the midnight sleigh had haunted Frosthaven. It would come without warning, its arrival heralded only by the faint sound of sleigh bells jingling against the crisp winter air. The sound was hypnotic, enchanting, drawing children to their windows. They'd press their noses to the glass, searching for the source of the magical melody. And there it would be, a magnificent sleigh pulled by 6 black reindeer with gleaming crimson eyes. The sleigh itself was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, with intricate carvings that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering moonlight. The driver, cloaked in a velvet red suit trimmed with tarnished gold, had an otherworldly presence. His face was obscured by a shadowy hood, but his voice, when he called to the children, was warm and inviting. "Come, little ones," he would say, his words like a lullaby woven into the wind. "A ride to remember, a Christmas adventure." And the children would go. Drawn by the allure of the sleigh, they would sneak out of their homes and climb aboard, giggling as they were whisked away into the night. By morning, they were gone, leaving only footprints in the snow that vanished at the edge of the woods. This year, it happened to Liam. Liam was the younger brother of Kara, a 16-year-old whose heart had hardened from years of living in Frosthaven. She'd seen too many classmates disappear, too many tearful candlelit vigils held in the town square. But Liam, only 9, still believed in the magic of Christmas. He refused to believe in the town's dark legends. "It's just a story," he'd scoffed earlier that day as they decorated their tree. "Santa's not scary." That night, Kara awoke to the faint sound of bells. Her stomach turned to ice as she bolted upright. "Liam!" she called, rushing to his room. The bed was empty, his blanket tangled on the floor. Panic surged as she looked out the window and saw him trudging through the snow, his small figure illuminated by the silvery glow of the moon. The sleigh waited at the edge of the woods, its driver's hand outstretched. "No!" Kara screamed, throwing on her boots and coat. She sprinted after him, the snow biting at her exposed skin. But by the time she reached the clearing, Liam was already aboard. The driver cracked his whip and the reindeer surged forward, their hooves sparking against the frozen ground. Without thinking, Kara lunged, grabbing hold of the sleigh's railing as it lifted into the air. The sleigh didn't soar into the sky as she'd expected. Instead, it plunged downward, into a swirling vortex of frost and shadow that opened beneath them. Kara clung tightly, her screams swallowed by the howling wind. When the sleigh finally came to a stop, she found herself in a world that was both dazzling and horrifying. The landscape stretched endlessly, a glittering wasteland of ice and ash. Jagged shards of crystal jutted from the ground, refracting light from an unseen source. Towering candy canes, twisted and blackened as if scorched, lined a narrow path leading into the distance. The air smelled faintly of peppermint, but it was cloying, sickly sweet. Overhead, the sky was a churning mass of red and green clouds, pulsating like a living thing. Kara stumbled to her feet, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Liam was nowhere to be seen. "Liam!" she called, her voice echoing eerily. "This way," came a voice, soft and lilting. She turned to see the driver standing beside the sleigh, his hood still obscuring his face. He gestured toward the path. "He's waiting for you." Kara hesitated but had no choice. She followed the path, her boots crunching against the brittle ground. As she walked, the twisted beauty of the landscape grew darker. The candy canes dripped with a viscous red liquid. Snowmen lined the path, their coal eyes replaced with gleaming sharp stones, their grins unnaturally wide. In the distance, a massive structure loomed. It was a castle made of ice, its spires jagged and uneven, glowing with an ominous blue light. But as she drew closer, Kara realized the ice wasn't clear. Shapes moved within it, faint and ghostly. Faces, children's faces, their expressions frozen in terror. Inside the castle, the air was heavy with the sound of muffled cries and eerie, discordant carols. The walls seemed alive, shifting and shimmering as if the ice itself were breathing. Kara's heart pounded as she entered a grand hall where a massive Christmas tree stood, its ornaments pulsating like beating hearts. At the base of the tree, children knelt in a trance-like state. Their eyes glazed over as they wrapped presents with trembling hands. Liam was among them. "Liam!" Kara ran to him, shaking his shoulders. He turned to her, his face pale and expressionless. "It's almost time," he whispered, his voice monotone. "He'll open the presents soon." "Who?" Kara demanded. "Me," came the deep, booming voice. She spun around to see the driver, now seated on a grotesque throne made of twisted sleigh parts and bones. His hood fell back, revealing a face that was both human and monstrous. His skin was ashen, his eyes pits of endless darkness, and his mouth stretched into an unnatural grin filled with jagged teeth. "Welcome, Kara," he said. "I've been waiting for you." Desperation surged within her. Kara grabbed a jagged shard of ice from the ground and lunged at the creature. He laughed, effortlessly deflecting her attack with a flick of his hand. The room erupted in chaos as the ornaments on the tree burst open, releasing ghostly figures that swirled around her, their screams deafening. But Kara refused to give up. She noticed the base of the tree, where a faint golden light glowed. The source of his power, she realized. She sprinted toward it, dodging the spectral figures. With all her strength, she drove the shard of ice into the glowing spot. The tree let out a piercing wail, the light shattering into a million fragments. The world began to crumble. The castle walls cracked and splintered, and the ground beneath her feet gave way. Kara grabbed Liam, pulling him close as they were engulfed by a blinding light. When she opened her eyes, they were back in Frosthaven, lying in the snow at the edge of the woods. The sleigh and its driver were gone, the only trace of them the faint sound of bells fading into the distance. Liam stirred, his eyes returning to their normal brightness. "Kara?" he murmured. She hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You're safe now," she whispered. But as they walked back to their house, Kara couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped entirely. For in the quiet of the night, she could still hear the faint jingling of bells. Then, as they crossed the threshold of their home, she noticed something on Liam's hand, a tiny crimson mark shaped like a bell. He smiled up at her, but his eyes flashed briefly with an unnatural red glow. Kara froze, her breath hitching. The realization hit her like a snowstorm. Liam had brought something back with him. Or perhaps he wasn't entirely Liam anymore. And in the silence, the faint jingling grew louder. The snowstorm began just as the Mason family's SUV pulled into the driveway of their rented cabin. Thick flakes swirled in the icy wind, muting every sound and turning the surrounding woods into a frozen monochrome world. The cabin itself was picture perfect, with red shutters, frosted windows, and a welcoming wreath on the door. Yet its remoteness and the heavy silence around it carried an uneasy weight, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Inside, the cabin was warm but strangely oppressive. A roaring fireplace cast flickering shadows on the wooden walls, and an enormous Christmas tree stood in the corner, draped in silver tinsel and flickering lights. The faint scent of pine mingled with something else, a faint metallic tang that made Holly Mason's nose wrinkle. "Something smells weird," she said, glancing around uneasily. Her father dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. "It's just the old wood, probably damp from the storm. Places like this have character." That night, as the family settled into their rooms, the strange noises began. Soft at first, like the rustle of dry leaves, they quickly grew louder, scratching, scraping. A sound like tiny claws skittering beneath the floorboards. At first, they thought it might be mice, but the noise was too deliberate, almost purposeful. The next morning, Holly discovered an old wooden box under the Christmas tree. It hadn't been there the night before. The box was intricately carved with swirling patterns that seemed to writhe when caught in the firelight. Inside was a porcelain-faced elf doll dressed in faded red and green velvet. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow Holly as she held it. A folded note lay beside it, written in spidery handwriting. "Be good, and I'll grant your wishes." Nate, Holly's older brother, snorted. "What is this, some creepy secret Santa? It's just an old decoration." But Holly was entranced. That night, she whispered her first wish to the elf. "I wish for snow so deep we don't have to go back to school." The next morning, the family awoke to find the cabin completely buried in snow. The windows were blocked by heavy drifts, and the door wouldn't budge. Holly's face lit up with delight, but her parents exchanged uneasy glances. The storm hadn't been forecasted to be this severe. As the days passed, Holly's wishes became more ambitious. She wished for gifts, and the next morning, the tree was surrounded by beautifully wrapped packages. She wished for an endless supply of cookies, and the pantry overflowed with baked goods. Each wish came true with eerie precision. Then, one night, she whispered a darker wish. "I wish Max would come back." Max had been the family dog, beloved but lost to illness the previous year. That night, the scratching beneath the floorboards became deafening. Growls and whimpers joined the cacophony, as if something was trying to claw its way into the room. The next morning, muddy paw prints trailed from the front door to Holly's room. But when Max appeared, he wasn't the same. His fur was patchy and matted, his eyes a sickly yellow, and his movements were stiff, as if he were a puppet held up by invisible strings. He growled at everyone but Holly, who hugged him tightly, oblivious to his unnatural state. Terrified, Nate confronted Holly. "This isn't normal. That thing is cursed. You have to stop making wishes." Holly refused to listen. "The elf is making Christmas better. You're just jealous." Frustrated, Nate took matters into his own hands. That night, he crept into Holly's room, snatched the elf, and carried it to the fireplace. As the flames engulfed it, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the cabin. The walls trembled, and the lights flickered violently. Nate's heart raced as the scream grew louder, no longer coming from the doll, but from deep beneath the floorboards. The floorboards splintered and cracked, and a grotesque figure emerged. It was the elf, but no longer the harmless doll. Its porcelain face was fractured, revealing jagged teeth beneath. Its body was a horrifying amalgamation of wood, sinew, and metal, and its glowing eyes burned with malice. "You broke the pact," it hissed, its voice like the rasp of nails on glass. Now you'll pay the price." The family scrambled to escape, but the snowdrifts had become solid walls of ice, trapping them inside. The elf moved with unnatural speed, its gnarled fingers snatching Nate and dragging him into the shadows. His screams faded into the howling wind as Holly sobbed, clutching her mother. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she cried. Her mother grabbed her shoulders. "You have to end it, Holly. You're the only one it listens to." Through her tears, Holly whispered, "I wish everything would go back to normal." The elf froze, its body jerking violently as if caught in an invisible vice. The cabin shook, the walls warped, and a deafening roar filled the air. A blinding light engulfed them, and Holly screamed. When she opened her eyes, the family was back in their SUV, parked at the bottom of the driveway. The storm was gone, and the cabin stood dark and silent. Holly clutched her mother's hand. "Let's go home," she whispered. As they drove away, none of them noticed the faint figure of the elf in the cabin window. Its cracked face twisted into a smile, and its glassy eyes gleamed with the promise of another Christmas to come. Weeks later, Holly couldn't shake the memories of the cabin. The cold, the screams, the creature's malice. It haunted her dreams. She scoured old books and forums, unraveling more about the Yule trickster. One evening, her research led to a chilling revelation. Destroying the effigy didn't destroy the spirit. It only released it. Strange occurrences began around their home. Ornaments moved on their own, faint scratching sounds came from the walls, and one night, Holly found a single carved box sitting beneath their tree. Her heart raced as she opened it. Inside was the same porcelain-faced elf, its cracks now smoothed over, its glassy eyes gleaming brighter than before. The note was different this time. "You can't escape me. Make your wish." Holly screamed, and her parents rushed into the room. But when they saw the box, it was empty. Her mother frowned. "Honey, are you feeling all right?" As they left her alone, Holly stared at the empty box, her breaths shallow. She knew the truth. The Yule trickster wasn't finished. It would wait, patient and eternal, for her to make another wish. And this time, she knew it would never let her go. The cabin stood at the edge of a snow-drenched forest, its sagging wooden beams and frost-covered windows giving it an air of isolation. The only signs of life were the flickering of the chimney's smoke and the faint glow of holiday lights strung haphazardly around the porch. "God, this place is a dump," Megan said, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck. Her breath fogged in the icy air as she kicked the snow from her boots. "Whose brilliant idea was this anyway?" Jared smirked, hefting a box of groceries. "That would be Alex, Mr. Let's Get Off the Grid." He nodded toward Alex, who was struggling to unlock the heavy wooden door. "It's not a dump," Alex muttered, shoving the door open with a creak. The interior smelled of pine and faint rot. "It's rustic. A little character never killed anyone." Katie, always the peacemaker, stepped inside first. "I think it's charming. Besides, we could all use a break. A quiet Christmas with just us sounds perfect." Her warm smile didn't quite reach her eyes. As they settled in, the group's awkwardness was palpable. The memory of the accident hung over them like a storm cloud. They had all been in the car that night, but it was Alex who had been driving when it slid off the icy road, killing their friend Sarah. Since then, nothing had been the same. That evening, as the fire crackled and snow piled against the windows, Jared rummaged through the kitchen. "Check this out," he called, holding up a leather-bound book. "Looks like someone's grandma left behind a cookbook." Megan peered over his shoulder. "Krampus Nacht Feast? Sounds metal. What's in it, reindeer stew?" Katie frowned, taking the book. Its cover was rough, its pages yellowed and brittle. The recipes were written in archaic handwriting, some of the ink smeared with what looked disturbingly like blood. This is weird. Alex, eager to lighten the mood, laughed. Come on, it's probably just an old prop. You know, some holiday kitsch to freak out tourists. Or a satanic cookbook, Jared quipped, flipping to a page titled The Devil's Roast. This one calls for ashes of regret. Guess we're fresh out of that, huh? Katie hesitated, her fingers trailing over the unsettling illustrations, twisted horns, shadowy figures, and what looked like human sacrifices. Maybe we shouldn't mess with it. Relax, Alex said, grabbing it from her. Let's make something. It's just for fun. The group reluctantly agreed, each taking turns preparing a dish. They laughed as they improvised, but as the food cooked, the air in the cabin seemed to shift. The fire burned lower and the shadows in the room deepened, almost alive. Katie glanced uneasily at the book, now open to a blank page where faint writing seemed to appear on its own. When they sat down to eat, the atmosphere felt strained. The food looked perfect, golden roast, spiced wine, and glistening pastries, but none of it smelled right. Here's to us, Alex said, raising his glass. Finally getting back together. No ghosts of Christmas past, right? Speak for yourself, Megan muttered, taking a sip of the wine. I swear this tastes like copper. Jared chuckled nervously. It's not bad. A little heavy on the regret, maybe? Katie couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in her gut. Guys, doesn't this feel wrong? Like the food, the book, everything. The lights flickered. A low groan echoed from the walls like the cabin itself was exhaling. Jared froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. Did anyone else hear that? Alex laughed it off, though his voice was tight. Old place, old pipes. Nothing to worry about. Megan stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. Yeah, well, old pipes don't make this kind of noise. She pointed to the frost-covered window where a shadow moved across the glass, a hulking figure with antlers and glowing red eyes. The fire roared suddenly, its flames leaping unnaturally high and turning black at the edges. The cabin plunged into freezing darkness, save for the crimson glow from the hearth. What the hell is happening? Megan shrieked, backing into a corner. Katie grabbed the book, her hands trembling as its pages flipped on their own. The text glowed with fiery red symbols. It's the book! It's doing something! The door blew open, snow swirling into the room. The figure in the window stepped inside, Krampus. He towered over them, his skeletal frame covered in matted fur. His horns scraped the ceiling and chains rattled with every step. His sack writhed with horrifying shapes, muffled screams escaping from within. Oh my God, Jared whispered, frozen in place. Krampus didn't speak but let out a guttural snarl that reverberated through the room. He raised a clawed hand, pointing at Megan. She screamed as chains shot from the shadows, wrapping around her and dragging her toward the sack. Help me! She screamed, clawing at the floor. Katie tried to grab her hand, but Krampus snarled, his eyes locking onto her. The force of his gaze sent her flying back, her head slamming against the wall. Katie and Alex stumbled into the kitchen, barricading the door. The book lay open between them, its text shifting. It's a ritual, Katie gasped. We summoned him with the feast. We have to complete the offering to send him back. Alex shook his head. No, there has to be another way. There isn't, Katie snapped, tears streaming down her face. Someone has to be sacrificed, or he'll take all of us. Outside, Jared's screams cut off abruptly. Heavy footsteps shook the cabin as Krampus approached the barricade. Alex looked at Katie, his face pale. I can't do it. Katie grabbed his hand, her voice breaking. It has to end, Alex, please. The door exploded inward and Krampus loomed over them. Katie stepped forward, trembling but resolute. Take me. Krampus tilted his head, his chain slithering toward her. But before he could claim her, Alex shoved her aside and lunged at Krampus. Take me instead. Krampus paused, his hollow eyes seeming to smile. The chains enveloped Alex, pulling him into the sack as Katie screamed. Epilogue. The curse lives on. The next morning, Katie woke alone. The cabin was eerily still, the book gone. Outside, fresh snow covered the ground, but deep hoofprints led away into the forest. A year later, a new group of friends arrived at the cabin, finding a welcoming fire, a delicious meal, and an old, leather-bound book resting on the mantel. The snowstorm had come suddenly, blanketing the small town of Maple Hollow in thick, heavy snow. Streets were deserted, and rooftops wore heavy white caps. Danny Ellis, an imaginative 8-year-old, saw the storm as the perfect opportunity to build the biggest, most impressive snowman the neighborhood had ever seen. "Come on, Mom. You promised you'd help," Danny begged, his gloved hands tugging at his mother's arm. Clara Ellis sighed, glancing out the frosted kitchen window at the swirling snow. "All right, Danny, but just for a little while. It's freezing out there." The two bundled up and trudged into the front yard, where the snow lay pristine and untouched. Danny's eyes gleamed with excitement as he began rolling the base of his snowman, gathering more and more snow until it stood nearly as tall as his chest. Clara helped pack the middle section, shaping it until it balanced perfectly atop the base. "It's going to be the best snowman ever," Danny declared. Clara chuckled. "What should we use for the face?" Danny rummaged through the garage and returned with a mismatched collection of items. 2 large black buttons for eyes, a carrot for the nose, and a crooked twig for the mouth. For the finishing touch, he borrowed his father's old wool scarf and an ancient dusty top hat he'd found in the attic. "Perfect," Danny said, stepping back to admire his work. The snowman loomed tall and imposing, its button eyes gleaming darkly in the fading light. The scarf flapped slightly in the wind, and for a moment, Clara thought the snowman seemed alive. She shook the thought away. That night, Danny lay in bed, listening to the wind howl outside. He felt a swell of pride at his creation, imagining how impressed his friends would be. But as he drifted off to sleep, he thought he heard something unusual, a faint crunching sound, like snow being compacted underfoot. The next morning, Danny leapt out of bed and ran to the window. His heart skipped a beat. The snowman was gone. He threw on his coat and boots, rushing outside. The spot where the snowman had stood was now just a messy mound of churned-up snow. Tracks, large, deep footprints, led away from the yard and down the street. Danny's breath fogged in the icy air as he stared at them. "Mom! Mom!" he yelled, running back inside. "The snowman's gone!" Clara looked up from her coffee, frowning. "Gone? What do you mean?" "Someone took it. There are footprints leading away." Clara sighed. "Danny, it was probably the wind. Or maybe some neighborhood kids messed with it. Don't worry about it." But Danny couldn't let it go. The footprints were too big to belong to any kids he knew, and the sheer size of the prints lingered in his mind. That night, as he sat at the dinner table with his mom and dad, he brought it up again. "What if it moved on its own?" he asked. His dad chuckled, ruffling his hair. "You've been watching too many movies, champ. Snowmen don't just get up and walk away." But later that night, Danny woke to a noise outside his window. The crunching sound was back, louder this time. He crept to the window, pulling aside the curtain. His stomach dropped. The snowman was back. It stood closer to the house now, positioned directly in the middle of their front yard. The crooked twig mouth seemed to twist into a sinister grin, and its button eyes glinted like obsidian in the moonlight. Danny stumbled backward, his heart racing. "Mom! Dad!" he screamed. Clara and her husband burst into the room. "Danny, what is it?" "The snowman, it's back. It moved." Clara pulled aside the curtain and frowned. "It's just where we built it yesterday." "No, it was gone this morning, I swear," Danny insisted. His dad sighed. "Look, buddy, it's late. You probably just had a bad dream," Danny yelled out loud. I'm not lying. Clara kissed his forehead. Go back to sleep, sweetie. We'll talk about it in the morning. But Danny couldn't sleep. He kept glancing at the window, watching the snowman. He could feel its gaze on him, cold and unyielding. Hours passed before exhaustion finally overtook him. The next morning, Clara screamed. Danny ran downstairs to find his father staring at the front door. Long, jagged scratches marred the wood, as if something with claws had tried to get in. The snowman was gone again, but the footprints remained, this time circling the house. This isn't funny, Clara said, her voice shaking. Who would do this? It's not someone, Danny whispered. It's the snowman. His parents exchanged uneasy glances. That evening, they double-checked the locks and drew the curtains tight. Danny sat in the living room, his knees pulled to his chest. What did we do to it? He asked softly. Clara hugged him. It's just a prank, honey. Someone's trying to scare us. But Danny wasn't so sure. That night, the family was awoken by a loud crash. They rushed downstairs to find the living room window shattered and snow scattered across the floor. The tracks led to the center of the room, where the snowman now stood, its twisted grin wider than ever. Clara gasped, clutching Danny. How did it get in here? We need to leave, Danny's father said, grabbing his keys. But as they turned toward the door, the snowman moved. Its branch-like arms creaked and extended, blocking their path. The button eyes seemed to glow, and a low, guttural sound filled the air, like the creaking of ice. Danny froze. What do you want? He whispered. The snowman's twig mouth twisted, forming a single word that filled the room with icy dread. Revenge. The snowman's glowing eyes flared brighter, casting an eerie light across the room. Clara stepped back, her voice trembling. What did we do to you? The snowman didn't respond, but its arms swung toward the walls, gouging deep marks into the plaster. Danny's father grabbed a fireplace poker, his knuckles white as he gripped it. Stay behind me, he ordered. The snowman tilted its head, then with sudden, inhuman speed, it lunged. The poker struck its chest, but instead of stopping it, the blow seemed to fuel its fury. Ice shards exploded outward, forcing the family to duck. Danny clutched his mother, tears streaming down his face. Make it stop, Clara cried, looking at Danny. You built it. Maybe it listens to you. Danny's voice cracked. I don't know what it wants. I just thought it was a snowman. The snowman's grin widened as it loomed over them, its icy breath chilling the room. Danny closed his eyes tightly, his voice trembling. I'm sorry. Please, just go away. For a moment, the snowman hesitated. The room grew deathly silent, save for the faint sound of dripping water as the snowman's icy form seemed to melt slightly. But then it straightened, its grin returning. Not enough, it rasped. You owe more. The lights flickered, and the house shuddered, as if the snowman's presence was warping reality itself. Outside, the wind howled, and the snow began piling higher against the walls, trapping them completely. Danny's father grabbed his phone, but the screen was dead, no signal. Clara held Danny tightly, her voice fierce. If you want revenge, take it on me. Leave my son alone. The snowman's eyes flickered, and it turned its head toward Clara. Sacrifice, it hissed, the word twisting in the air like a blade. Danny's heart pounded as he watched his mother step forward. No, he shouted. You can't have her. The snowman loomed closer to Clara, its icy hand reaching out. As its fingers brushed her arm, frost began to creep up her skin. Danny screamed and lunged forward, grabbing the scarf he had tied around its neck. Stop it, he yelled, pulling with all his might. The snowman froze, its body jerking violently. The scarf unraveled in Danny's hands, and for a moment, it looked as if the snowman might collapse. But then it turned its gaze back to him, its grin twisting into something even more malevolent. "Now you've done it," it whispered. The house plunged into darkness, and a bone-chilling wind howled through the shattered window. When the lights flickered back on, the snowman was gone. In its place was a single footprint in the snow, larger than any human's, leading toward Danny's room upstairs. It was Christmas Eve, and the city was cloaked in a heavy blanket of snow. The streets, slick with ice, shimmered under the pale glow of the streetlights. Mark Carter gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove through the deserted downtown, muttering to himself about the delay in finding the perfect gift for his daughter Emily. The guilt gnawed at him. Work had consumed his December, leaving little time for holiday shopping. That's when he'd stumbled upon an online marketplace listing for a vintage porcelain doll, just like the ones Emily had admired in her grandmother's attic. The seller's price was suspiciously low, but Mark dismissed it. He only cared about making his daughter happy. When he arrived at the address, a decrepit old house on the outskirts of town, Mark hesitated. The windows were dark, and the house seemed to sag under the weight of years of neglect. Still, he knocked. An elderly woman answered, her pale blue eyes glinting in the dim light of the porch. "You came for the doll," she said, her voice raspy and dry. Mark nodded, his eyes falling to the box she held. It was wrapped in faded red paper tied with a black ribbon. "She's special," the woman said cryptically as she handed it over. "Treat her with care." The exchange was brief, and Mark left feeling oddly unsettled. He tried to shake off the unease as he drove home, the box resting in the passenger seat. Occasionally, he swore he heard a faint tapping noise, like nails gently scraping the inside of the box, but he chalked it up to his imagination. At home, the warmth of the living room greeted him. The tree stood tall and glowing, draped in tinsel and colorful lights. Mark set the box on the coffee table and carefully unwrapped it. The doll inside was exquisite. Her porcelain face was painted with delicate precision. Her glassy blue eyes seemed almost lifelike, and her crimson lips were frozen in a soft, enigmatic smile. She wore a faded velvet dress with lace trim, her tiny hands adorned with lace gloves. A wave of unease swept over him as he adjusted her posture. The doll's eyes seemed to follow him, their gleam unnervingly sharp in the soft light of the room. "It's just a doll," he muttered, shaking his head. Mark wrapped her in bright paper and placed the gift under the tree. As he stood back to admire the arrangement, a peculiar chill swept through the room. The fireplace crackled weakly, but the warmth seemed unable to penetrate the growing sense of dread. He dismissed the sensation, blaming it on exhaustion. But the night had other plans. Around midnight, Mark was jolted awake by a noise from the living room. It sounded like the faint shuffle of footsteps. He sat up, his heart pounding, and strained to listen. The house was silent, save for the faint rustle of the Christmas tree branches. Deciding it was probably just the wind, he lay back down. The noise came again. This time it was followed by a soft giggle, high-pitched and childlike. Mark's blood turned to ice. He grabbed his phone for light and crept toward the living room. The tree's lights flickered as he entered. The room felt colder, and the faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, a scent he didn't remember noticing before. The presents were as he'd left them, except for one. The box containing the doll was askew, the paper slightly torn. His stomach churned. "Emily must have gotten up early," he whispered, though the words felt hollow. He resealed the wrapping and went back to bed. Yet, sleep refused to come. Every creak of the house, every sigh of the wind seemed magnified. He swore he could hear whispers, indistinct and fleeting, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. By morning, the unease had reached a boiling point. Mark awoke to find the doll unwrapped and sitting beneath the tree. Her head was tilted slightly, her eyes fixed on the hallway leading to Emily's room. "Emily, did you open your gift early?" he called, his voice tight. Emily poked her head around the corner, rubbing her eyes. "What gift?" she asked, yawning. Mark froze. "The doll," he said, gesturing to the tree. Emily frowned. "I haven't touched anything." A chill ran down his spine. "Okay, maybe I unwrapped it by mistake," he said, forcing a smile. But his hands trembled as he reached for the doll. Its porcelain face felt icy cold, and the enigmatic smile now seemed more sinister than sweet. That evening, as the family gathered for Christmas dinner, the doll sat on a shelf in the living room, its glassy eyes catching the flickering candlelight. Mark tried to ignore it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him. The whispers returned, faint but persistent, just beneath the edge of hearing. After dinner, he decided to put the doll in the attic. "It's just a doll," he repeated to himself as he climbed the narrow stairs. But as he placed her on a dusty shelf, her head tilted suddenly, as if nodding. Mark stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. He slammed the attic door shut and locked it. But that night, the dreams began. He saw the doll standing over him, her glass eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. She whispered his name, her voice a chilling blend of a child's laughter and something far older. Christmas morning arrived, but the joy was overshadowed by Mark's growing paranoia. The doll was back under the tree, despite the locked attic door. Emily squealed with delight when she saw it, hugging it tightly. Mark's heart sank. "Be careful with it, sweetie," he said, his voice hoarse. That night, as the family slept, Mark was awoken by a blood-curdling scream. He raced to Emily's room, finding her bed empty and the doll sitting in the middle of the floor. Its glassy eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and its painted smile seemed wider, more jagged. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with an unbearable cacophony. Mark turned to flee, but found the door shut tight. The last thing he saw was the doll's tiny hand reaching for him, its porcelain fingers impossibly sharp. And then, silence. The isolated research facility at the North Pole, known only as Operation Frost, had been abandoned by the outside world. The snowstorms that constantly ravaged the area had shielded its existence from the public eye for years. Deep beneath the ice, beyond the reach of satellite surveillance, the facility hid secrets buried for decades, secrets that were about to awaken on Christmas Eve. The compound was a sprawling complex of metal and glass designed to withstand the harshest conditions. Stark, sterile hallways stretched endlessly beneath dim, flickering lights, casting long, unnatural shadows. The walls were lined with high-tech equipment, all of it now obsolete, yet eerily functional in the frozen silence. The hum of the ventilation systems and the buzz of old monitors seemed like ghosts of the past, as if the facility itself were still alive but barely breathing. The research team, led by Dr. Evelyn Marsh, was the last group stationed here. She was a determined woman in her mid-40s, with sharp features and a haunted look in her eyes that had seen too much and had learned to ignore the creeping dread that seemed to seep into every corner of the compound. Her team included Marcus Granger, an ex-military security officer with a stone-cold exterior, and Lena Tran, a young and brilliant scientist who specialized in ancient folklore and mythology. That night, as a violent snowstorm raged outside, the power flickered and dimmed. It was the eve of Christmas, and the team had just completed their most daring experiment yet. The air was thick with tension as they stood in the facility's main control room, staring at the large screen that displayed a symbol, a twisted ancient glyph that seemed to writhe and shimmer on its own. "This is it," Lena said, her voice trembling as she adjusted her glasses. "We've unlocked it. The Christmas curse. I don't like this, Marcus muttered, his broad shoulders stiffening. The power's going out. We should pull the plug and abort this experiment. We're messing with forces we don't understand. Dr. Marsh held up a hand, her icy blue eyes fixed on the screen. This is our last chance. We're this close to proving the existence of Christmas magic. The world will never be the same once we release it. What exactly are we releasing? Lena asked, her voice small as she stepped back from the screen. Dr. Marsh looked at her, her face pale but determined. An ancient entity. We don't know its full name, but its power has been buried under the ice for centuries. It's tied to the first Christmas, before Santa Claus, before the stories we know. It was something darker, something we were never meant to understand. Marcus's hands clenched into fists. Something darker? You can't be serious? You think that's what we're dealing with? Before anyone could respond, a loud crack echoed from deep within the facility. The ground trembled slightly, as if the building itself was shifting. The temperature inside plummeted, the heating systems now completely failing. "What the hell was that?" Marcus demanded, his voice now laced with panic. Dr. Marsh didn't answer. Instead, she rushed to a console, typing frantically. "It's beginning. We've triggered it. We've made contact." Lena's breath caught in her throat as she peered over Dr. Marsh's shoulder. The symbol on the screen began to bleed, its edges turning black and jagged as a deep, guttural voice echoed through the speakers. "Santa has abandoned you, but I remain." The room fell silent, the oppressive cold setting in. For the first time, Lena felt a chill that wasn't just from the temperature. "Abort!" Marcus shouted, grabbing Dr. Marsh by the arm, but she jerked away, her eyes wide with obsession. "No, it's too late. We've opened the door. Now we must face it." Suddenly the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Only the emergency lights flickered, casting an eerie red glow over everything. Then from the shadows, they heard it. Heavy, shuffling footsteps, accompanied by a deep, growling laughter. "I am your true Santa," the voice said, and this time it was much closer. Lena gasped and grabbed Marcus's arm. "We have to get out of here! Now!" They bolted from the room, rushing through the halls. As they turned a corner, they saw it. Standing in the middle of the hallway was an impossibly tall, grotesque figure. Its face obscured by the shadows, but its eyes glowed a fiery red. Its body was dressed in tattered remnants of a red coat, stained with dark, congealing substance. Its antlered crown twisted like horns, and from beneath its cloak, sharp, bony fingers extended like claws. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a beast. It was a nightmarish hybrid, something ancient, something vengeful. "Run!" Marcus screamed. The creature didn't chase them. It simply stood there, watching them with its fiery eyes, waiting. They turned a corner, sprinting toward the exit. But as they reached the final door to the outside world, they found it locked, frozen solid. "We're trapped," Lena cried. Dr. Marsh's face was now ashen. This was part of the plan. It's not just one entity. There's more. It was never meant to be a singular force. We've unlocked all of them, the ancient forces of winter and Christmas, and they're all coming for us." The temperature in the hallway plummeted to impossible levels. Frost creeping up the walls, and the air growing thick with an unnatural cold. The creature's voice echoed again, now a booming, demonic growl. "You opened the door, and now you belong to me." As the walls seemed to close in around them, Lena's mind raced, and she realized something horrifying. The creature wasn't just here for them, it was using them as bait. A horrible, cold realization crept over her as she turned to Dr. Marsh. You've been preparing us for this, haven't you? You knew it would be like this." Dr. Marsh's eyes were filled with a desperate longing. "You don't understand. We were never meant to survive." The emergency lights flickered one last time before they went out completely, and the compound was plunged into complete darkness. Suddenly, everything went silent. Everything. And so, dear listener, another tale fades into the shadows. But remember, the darkness doesn't sleep. It only waits. If you enjoyed tonight's story, leave a like and share it with someone who dares to dream in the dark. Subscribe and make sure you hit the bell, so you'll never miss when the next nightmare begins. Sleep well, if you can.